Welcome to Codex Mentis, Science and Technology to Study Cognition. For this deep dive, we're going to explore the underlying mechanics of scientific truth.
Right, the actual machinery behind what gets published and what does not.
Exactly. Our mission for this conversation is to explore how to read science like a scientist. We really want to unpack the systemic pressures, the methodological pitfalls, and the massive technological shifts that are actively influencing the knowledge that reaches the public.
And we are approaching this with a healthy dose of skepticism, which is really the only way to evaluate research integrity.
I completely agree. And you are invited to join us on this rigorous, friendly exploration. All the references for the materials we will be discussing today are cited in the deep dive description.
We should probably start with the initiative that attempts to tackle this problem at the educational root.
Yes, the workshop. So I was looking at the setup for this, and what immediately stuck out to me was the intentional lack of barriers. It is a workshop that was led by Dr. Pablo Bernabeu at the Oxford Brookes University Science Bazaar.
Titled, Unlock the Lab, Your Guide to Reading Science Like a Scientist.
Right. And it is supported by a remarkably accessible web application. I mean, there is no login required.
None at all. It is entirely browser-based.
Yeah.
You do not need to create an account, and you do not need any prior knowledge of scientific methodology.
Which makes it incredibly versatile. You could use it in university workshops, open science training events, or, just sitting at home doing self-directed learning.
The accessibility is definitely the focal point. But the pedagogical approach is what really deserves our attention here. The traditional model of teaching science literacy usually relies on passive consumption.
Like reading a textbook chapter on experimental design.
Or sitting in a lecture hall, listening to someone detail logical fallacies for an hour. This application discards that passive model entirely.
It throws you right into the deep end.
It does, but in a very controlled environment. Instead of just receiving information, participants actively engage with 48 distinct fictional research scenarios.
And I really want to dig into the structure of those fictional scenarios because the exercise itself is fascinating. For each of the 48 studies presented, you are not just asked whether you think the study is good or bad.
No, you are given a very specific dual challenge.
Which forms the foundation of its peer-anchored design.
Exactly. When you read a scenario, the absolute first thing you must do is predict how the average workshop participant will rate that exact same study.
On a scale of 1 to 7.
Right, with 1 representing low quality and 7 representing high quality. You have to lock in that prediction about the crowd before you're allowed to do anything else.
And only after predicting the crowd's reaction do you provide your own scientific assessment.
Using that exact same 1 to 7 scale, yes. But for your own rating, you are supposed to apply expert evidence-based criteria.
I found that dual mechanism really thought-provoking. It forces you to articulate your own beliefs about quality research while simultaneously demanding that you reflect critically on how your beliefs might diverge from the broader community standard.
It acts as a mirror for cognitive bias.
It really does. You have to evaluate the methodology of the science, but you also have to model the psychology of the people in the room with you.
It forces a calibration of judgment. And the scoring system is meticulously designed around that specific dynamic.
Because your score isn't based on getting the objectively correct answer right.
Precisely. The application does not score you on whether you agree with a predetermined answer set by the instructor. Your ultimate score is based purely on your prediction accuracy. It simply measures how well you anticipate the consensus of your peers.
And the mathematical formula they use for the scoring is actually really forgiving, which I appreciate because nothing kills the desire to learn faster than a punitive grading system.
The formula is mathematically elegant. They take 100, subtract the absolute difference between your predicted rating and the actual peer average, and then multiply that difference by 12.
Right, so because the scale is only 1 to 7, the absolute worst you can do is be off by 6 points.
Exactly. Say you guess the crowd will hate a study and give it a 1, but they actually love it and give it a 7. Your error is 6.
And multiplying that error of 6 by 12 gives you 72. So 100 minus 72 leaves you with 28 points.
Even a completely fundamentally wrong guess still leaves you with a baseline of 28 points.
It keeps you in the game. It doesn't punish you for learning.
That is a crucial design choice for maintaining engagement. If they'd used a harsher multiplier, a single maximum error prediction could drop a user's score all the way to 0.
Which would just be incredibly demoralizing.
It would. The forgiving nature of the mathematics creates a psychological safety net, keeping participants motivated to complete the entire suite of scenarios.
And building on that psychological safety, the application uses automated anonymous usernames.
Which is essential.
Yeah, you might log in and be assigned a name like Cheerful Penguin or Wise Owl. You earn badges and climb a public leaderboard based on your prediction accuracy, but your actual identity is completely protected.
Fear of public embarrassment is a massive barrier to participation in any academic or training environment. By decoupling the user's real identity from their performance, the workshop fosters a lively, competitive environment where people actually feel comfortable taking risks.
Because making mistakes is exactly how genuine learning occurs. To truly ground this for the listener, we should walk through some of the specific fictional scenarios the application uses.
Because while the scenarios themselves are entirely fictional, the dynamics and the red flags they expose are very real.
Let's look at the chocolate and math study. This one plays right into our natural confirmation bias. The application presents a fictional study claiming that eating a chocolate-based breakfast dramatically improves mathematical performance in school-aged children.
Which is a headline anyone would want to believe.
We all want chocolate to make us smarter, but the application guides you to look closer. The very first red flag is the publication source. This fictional study is published in a journal that charges authors a massive publication fee rather than charging readers for subscriptions.
And we really need to pause there, because the economics of academic publishing are complex.
I actually want to play devil's advocate here for a second regarding those publication fees. Aren't open access journals supposed to charge authors so that the public can read the research for free?
That is the standard open access model, yes.
So we always hear that paywalls are bad for science. How are you supposed to tell the difference between a legitimate open access fee and a predatory journal that is just looking to make a quick buck?
That exact tension is what the scenario is designed to highlight. You are completely correct that legitimate open access journals charge article processing charges. They need that money to cover the costs of peer review, professional editing, and server hosting.
So the fee itself is not inherently evil.
Not inherently, no. However, the predatory publishing model explicitly exploits this mechanism. A predatory journal charges the fee, but entirely skips the rigorous peer review process.
Because their primary goal is revenue generation.
Exactly. Their goal is not scientific integrity. They will publish essentially anything, no matter how flawed the methodology is, as long as the author pays the fee.
So the insight here is not that all author fees are bad.
Right. The insight is that a fee combined with a lack of transparency, or a suspiciously fast turnaround time from submission to publication, or an editorial board filled with unknown names, constitutes a massive red flag.
That makes a lot of sense. You have to look at the combination of factors. And beyond the predatory journal aspect, the chocolate study scenario exposes a massive issue with how conclusions are drawn from data.
The extrapolation problem.
Yes, the fictional conclusion in this study is wildly overblown. It takes a short-term feeling of alertness.
Which is almost certainly just a basic physiological response to the caffeine and sugar found in chocolate.
Right, just a sugar rush. And the authors extrapolate that short-term rush into a sweeping claim about long-term cognitive benefits and the enhancement of complex mathematical reasoning.
The broader insight for you as a listener here is about how media narratives weaponize our desire for easy fixes.
The real lesson isn't just about spotting a bad journal.
It is about realizing that the more a headline tells you exactly what you want to hear, the harder you need to scrutinize the underlying methodology. The application trains the user to separate the actual, often mundane data from the sensationalized narrative that the authors, or perhaps a university press office, are trying to spin.
There is another scenario they use that tackles a completely different corner of the research world. It involves treating insomnia with lavender essential oil.
Which brings in a whole different set of methodological red flags.
In this scenario, the study is hidden behind an expensive paywall in a low-tier complementary medicine journal. But the real kicker is the actual design of the experiment. It features a severely underpowered sample size.
They are making sweeping claims about human sleep architecture based on a handful of participants.
Exactly.
And the statistical power of a study is arguably its most critical component. If you're trying to detect a subtle effect.
Like the impact of an aroma on sleep latency.
Right. A subtle physiological shift. You need a massive number of data points to separate the actual effect of the lavender from the random noise of human biology. A study with 10 or 20 people simply cannot generate statistically meaningful conclusions for that type of variable.
The lavender scenario essentially teaches users to rigorously scrutinize source credibility, demand open access to data so the math can be independently checked, and always look at the sample size before believing a claim.
When you read an article claiming a miracle cure or a catastrophic new threat, your first instinct should not be panic or excitement.
Your first instinct should be to ask, how many people were actually in this trial?
Precisely. And the workshop culminates in an exercise that really forces you to weigh these different factors against each other.
The token allocation.
Yes, at the end of the session, participants are given 20 digital tokens. They have to distribute these tokens across the various evaluation criteria they used during the workshop.
Things like methodology, source credibility, open access, and whether the conclusion actually matches the data.
It is a brilliant exercise in resource allocation because it reveals your underlying philosophy of science. How you allocate those 20 tokens reflects your own personal scientific values.
Do you place all your tokens on methodology, believing that a perfectly designed experiment is the only thing that matters, even if the paper is hidden behind a $30 paywall?
Or do you heavily weight open access, operating under the belief that science is effectively useless if the broader community cannot scrutinize the raw data?
It forces a realization of where you place the most importance when judging the validity of information.
And that philosophy of science does not just exist in a vacuum. It dictates how we function as a society, how we allocate public funding, and how we make medical decisions.
Which brings us to a much darker reality. The scenarios in Unlock the Lab are functional, fictional training tools. But when you start talking about methodology and source credibility, it naturally opens the door to the very real dynamics of questionable research practices occurring in actual laboratories right now.
The transition from the fictional to the real is sobering.
Very. The source material includes an extensive meta-analysis that attempts to quantify exactly how often researchers engage in irresponsible behaviors that actively damage the value of science.
And the data in that meta-analysis requires a very measured, careful perspective. It unpacks the prevalence of different types of misconduct, and the distinctions between those types are vital.
So let us start with the worst offenses.
Right. When we examine severe research misconduct, which is strictly defined by federal agencies as fabrication, falsification, and plagiarism, the self-reported numbers are actually relatively low. Roughly 2.9% of researchers admit to committing these severe career-ending offenses.
Just to be clear on the definitions, fabrication being literally making up data out of thin air.
Yes, generating numbers that never existed.
And falsification being tweaking the numbers you did gather from an experiment to make the results look better.
Precisely. 2.9% admit to that. However, when the researchers broaden the scope of the survey to include what are known as questionable research practices, that number jumps significantly.
12.5% of researchers self-report engaging in these softer but still deeply problematic behaviors.
But the self-reported numbers only tell a fraction of the story.
Because people lie on surveys.
They do. When the survey flips the perspective and asks researchers if they have ever witnessed others committing these acts, the numbers absolutely skyrocket.
Nearly 16% report witnessing severe misconduct like outright fabrication.
And almost 40% report witnessing their colleagues engaging in questionable research practices.
That massive discrepancy between self-reporting and witnessing is probably the most revealing data point in the entire meta-analysis.
It strongly suggests that these behaviors are incredibly widespread, but they are heavily underreported by the individuals actually committing them.
I mean, it makes perfect sense from a human psychology standpoint. It is social desirability bias in action.
Nobody wants to view themselves as the villain.
Exactly. Nobody wants to fill out a survey, even an anonymous one, and check a box that says, yes, I am a fraud who corrupts human knowledge. But it is much easier to point the finger and say, well, I saw the scientist at the desk next to me doing something shady last semester.
It is social desirability bias, combined with a very rational fear of professional destruction. Admitting to misconduct, even informally, carries the immense risk of losing grants, being fired, and having your entire body of work retracted.
But the bystander effect here is profoundly damaging. If 40% of researchers are witnessing questionable practices and the academic system continues to function as normal, it means there is a pervasive culture of silence.
So what do these questionable research practices actually look like when you were standing in the laboratory?
The sources detail a comprehensive survey of researchers in the quantitative humanities, specifically focusing on applied linguistics, to get a granular look at these behaviors.
And one of the most frequently cited issues in that discipline is a practice known as hypothesizing after the results are known.
which fundamentally subverts the scientific method.
It does. In rigorous experimental design, a researcher must state their hypothesis first. They declare exactly what they expect to happen, they design an experiment to test that specific prediction, and then they report the results.
Whether those results support the initial hypothesis or completely contradict it.
Exactly. But hypothesizing after the results are known completely flips the timeline.
A researcher runs an experiment, looks at a massive spreadsheet of unexpected, messy data, finds one weird little correlation that they never intended to study.
And then they retroactively write their introduction and literature review as if they have predicted that exact weird correlation from the very beginning.
The analogy of painting a bullseye around an arrow after it has already hit the wall is highly appropriate here.
It is the perfect visual. It makes the research look incredibly predictive, tidy, and successful.
But it strips away the vital context of all the other variables that were tested and failed. It turns exploratory observation into a false confirmation, which deeply misleads anyone trying to build upon that research in the future.
I know if my entire career and promotion schedule depended on publishing a groundbreaking, clear narrative every single year, I would be incredibly tempted to find patterns in the static too.
It is like being a real estate agent where you only get paid if the house you are selling makes the national news. You are going to start describing a leaky roof as a bespoke indoor water feature.
And that immense pressure to produce a successful positive narrative connects directly to another massive issue detailed in the sources, the file drawer issue.
The file drawer issue represents perhaps the largest systemic distortion of the scientific record in existence.
It occurs when a researcher conducts a rigorously designed, perfectly executed study, but the results simply do not show a statistically significant effect. The intervention did not work.
Because academic journals historically have an overwhelming preference for publishing exciting, novel, positive results, the researcher knows this paper will likely be rejected.
So they simply choose not to write it up. They put the raw data in a metaphorical file drawer and move on to the next project.
Let us spend some time on this because the real-world consequences of the file drawer issue are terrifying, especially when you think about medical trials.
It warps our entire understanding of reality.
Imagine 5 different independent laboratories around the world are all testing a new chemical compound to see if it reduces blood pressure. 4 of those laboratories run the trial, and the compound does absolutely nothing. The results are totally flat.
Because of the file drawer effect, none of those 4 labs publish their findings. It is deemed uninteresting.
But the 5th laboratory, purely by random statistical chance, gets a slight positive result. In any large data set, anomalies naturally occur.
Because the result is positive and exciting, they submit it to a high-impact journal, and it gets published.
Exactly. So now a doctor or a public health policymaker searches the scientific literature for this compound. They do not see the 4 failed trials sitting in file drawers in Boston, London, Tokyo, and Berlin.
They only see the one published paper claiming the compound works.
The entire medical community is given a completely false impression of certainty because the scientific record has become a highly curated highlight reel rather than an objective logbook of reality.
And the economic waste generated by this practice is also staggering. If those negative results are not published, other laboratories will inevitably secure funding to test the exact same compound, completely unaware that it has already failed multiple times.
Millions of dollars and years of human effort are wasted repeating invisible failures.
When I first saw the next term in the source material, salami publication, I honestly thought it was about food science or agricultural processing.
I had the exact same thought. But it is actually a strategy for gaming the publication metrics.
It is entirely about metrics. Salami publication is the practice of taking the results of a single, cohesive research project and slicing them up into multiple paper-thin manuscripts.
Instead of publishing one comprehensive, deeply informative paper, a researcher might slice the data to publish 3 or 4 fragmented papers.
The singular goal of this practice is to artificially inflate the researcher's publication count on their curriculum vitae.
Because hiring committees and grant boards often do not have the time to sit down and deeply read 20 papers by a candidate. They just look at the raw number.
If candidate A has 5 comprehensive papers and candidate B has 15 sliced-up salami papers, candidate B often looks better on a spreadsheet.
And the consequence for the broader scientific community is severe literature dilution. It floods the academic databases with fragmented, redundant, deeply repetitive papers.
It makes it incredibly difficult for other scientists to synthesize the true findings of a field, because they have to read 4 separate papers just to piece together the methodology of a single experiment.
But how do we actually know how common salami publishing or the file drawer issue is? We already established that people lie on surveys because of social desirability bias. If I am slicing my data, I am not going to confess to it.
That is where the methodology of the surveys themselves becomes fascinating. The source material details a massive study conducted across multiple academic disciplines in the Netherlands.
To get around the problem of researchers lying, they utilized a highly sophisticated statistical tool called the randomized response technique.
I want to break down how the randomized response technique works, because it is essentially a mathematical magic trick for extracting the truth from liars.
It is designed to get people to admit to rule breaking without any fear of personal exposure. Basically, a surveyor asks a highly sensitive question like, have you ever engaged in salami publication?
But before the researcher answers, they have to roll a die or use a random number generator that the surveyor cannot see.
The invisibility of the randomizer is the absolute key.
The instructions might dictate that if the die lands on a 1, 2, 3, or 4, the researcher must answer the question completely honestly.
However, if the die lands on a 5 or a 6, the researcher is instructed to simply say yes, regardless of what the actual truth is.
Right. So if a researcher looks the surveyor in the eye and says yes, the surveyor has absolutely no idea if that is a genuine confession of scientific misconduct, or if the researcher just happened to roll a 6.
The individual is completely, perfectly insulated from any consequences. There is zero reason to lie.
But while the individual's answer is a mystery, the aggregate data is highly revealing, because statisticians know the exact probability of rolling a 5 or a 6.
Which is roughly 33%.
Exactly. They know exactly what percentage of the total yes responses are forced by the die. By subtracting that expected mathematical baseline of forced yeses from the total number of yeses received, they can accurately calculate the true prevalence of the behavior across the entire surveyed population.
It is brilliant. And what this highly secure, totally anonymous survey revealed is a massive insight into the academic mindset.
It showed that researchers overwhelmingly feel that their engagement in these questionable practices is justifiable.
They do not view things like the file drawer issue or hypothesizing after the results are known as absolute black and white ethical violations.
They view them as existing in a gray zone. The qualitative data suggests they rationalize these behaviors as necessary adaptations for survival in a fundamentally broken environment.
They see it as playing the game the way the rules are currently written rather than cheating.
But that raises a huge question. If all these scientists know what the file drawer issue is and they know what salami slicing is, why do they keep doing it?
The qualitative data points a pretty harsh finger directly at the universities and the funding structures themselves. We are not looking at a few bad apples, we are looking at a bad barrel.
It is intellectual laziness to attribute this purely to individual moral failure. The qualitative interviews gathered from federally funded scientists are remarkably consistent.
They overwhelmingly describe a hyper-competitive, almost toxic academic environment. They are operating within a strict publish or perish culture.
In this environment, your ability to secure a job, achieve tenure, maintain your laboratory space, and literally pay your mortgage is tied almost exclusively to your publication metrics and your ability to continually secure grant funding.
It is a relentless treadmill.
And the primary metric used to evaluate their success on that treadmill is the journal impact factor.
The history of the journal impact factor is a perfect example of a metric mutating beyond its original purpose.
It was originally designed in the mid-20th century as a tool for university librarians. It simply measured the average number of citations received by papers in a specific journal.
It was meant to help librarians decide which journals were popular enough to justify purchasing an expensive subscription.
But somehow, it morphed into the ultimate arbiter of a human being's scientific worth. Hiring committees began using the impact factor of the journals a scientist published in as a crude, lazy proxy for the actual quality of that scientist's research.
Instead of reading a candidate's paper to see if the methodology was sound, they just looked to see if it was published in a journal with an impact factor of 20 versus an impact factor of 2.
When you tie career survival to publishing in high-impact journals, you fundamentally change what kind of science gets done.
Because high-impact journals maintain their high impact by publishing splashy, highly novel, surprising findings that will generate headlines and attract subsequent citations.
This systemic obsession with novelty explicitly rewards researchers for pushing boundaries. but it simultaneously heavily penalizes rigorous verification.
That brings us to the tragic irony of the replication crisis. The foundational pillar of the scientific method is replication.
If I find that a certain chemical cures a disease, you need to be able to run the exact same experiment in your lab and get the exact same result.
That is how we know something is actually true and not just a statistical fluke. But no one wants to fund or publish replication studies.
If a brilliant young scientist spends 3 years meticulously repeating a famous, established experiment to verify its accuracy, and they find out that the original experiment was correct, high-impact journals will almost universally reject their paper.
The editorial response is essentially, we already knew this. It is not new. This system systematically undervalues the very mechanism that makes science reliable.
And it deeply discourages publishing those negative results we talked about earlier. In the qualitative surveys we were looking at, the scientists frequently expressed immense, boiling frustration with the current peer review system regarding this exact issue.
They are demanding that the academic journals take responsibility for publishing negative results.
Their argument is structurally sound. Knowing what does not work is just as vital to the progression of human knowledge as knowing what does work.
The journals act as the gatekeepers of the scientific record, and by only opening the gates for positive results, they are actively distorting reality.
So how do universities currently try to fix this? Usually by forcing graduate students to take ethics classes.
But here is a highly surprising finding from the surveys. Researchers have almost zero confidence in the ability of standard ethics training to actually improve research integrity.
And the context we just discussed explains exactly why that training fails. Simply putting a cohort of doctoral students in a lecture hall for 2 hours and defining the terms of misconduct is remarkably ineffective.
Because the moment they leave that classroom, they re-enter a professional incentive structure that actively punishes them for following the rules.
It is like teaching someone the principles of defensive driving in a classroom and then dropping them into a demolition derby where their salary is entirely dependent on how many other cars they can destroy.
You are teaching them the idealized rules of an imaginary utopia, but evaluating their careers based on a completely different set of brutal survival metrics.
Now, it is important to acknowledge that there are institutional shifts occurring. Some major funding bodies and institutional frameworks, particularly within the United Kingdom and the United States, have begun to formally recognize the value of open science practices and public engagement.
There are pilot programs attempting to evaluate researchers on a broader set of contributions, such as their willingness to share raw data, their mentorship records, and the quality of their peer reviews.
But the qualitative data makes it crystal clear that a massive gap still persists between the stated, idealized goals of science and the actual operational professional rewards allocated to researchers on the ground.
The cultural shift is moving at a glacial pace compared to the pressure cooker the scientists are actually living in, which means we have to view scientific publications not just as disembodied, objective truths descending from a mountaintop, but as highly pressured, deeply human products generated within a flawed ecosystem.
And if navigating that flawed human ecosystem was not complex enough, we must now introduce the latest dynamic that is violently reshaping research integrity.
We are witnessing the rapid, almost overwhelming integration of generative artificial intelligence into the scientific workflow.
This is where the landscape completely changes shape. The source material includes a massive quantitative analysis that attempts to map this shift.
They are not just looking at a survey of a few hundred people. They analyzed over 41 million research papers published over several decades.
They're looking at the macro-level impact of artificial intelligence on the fabric of scientific production. And the data unequivocally reveals that artificial intelligence tools bring immense, tangible benefits to the individual scientists who use them.
The competitive advantage is stark. Research papers that utilize or focus on artificial intelligence receive significantly more citations than their non-artificial intelligence counterparts.
Furthermore, the career trajectories of the scientists themselves are accelerated. Scientists who aggressively adopt these artificial intelligence tools transition to becoming established, independent project leaders significantly faster than their peers who rely on traditional methods.
Which creates a tremendously powerful, almost irresistible personal incentive.
If using artificial intelligence means your paper gets cited twice as much, you secure grant funding faster, and you get tenure 3 years earlier, there is an overwhelming pressure to integrate artificial intelligence into every possible research domain.
Regardless of whether it is strictly necessary or even appropriate for the specific scientific question you are trying to answer, you use it because it is the new currency of success.
But this introduces a severe structural paradox that requires very careful examination. While artificial intelligence dramatically expands the impact, reach, and velocity of an individual scientist, the 41 million paper dataset demonstrates that it actually contracts the collective focus of science as a whole.
I really want to make sure we explain this clearly because it feels counterintuitive. If individuals are doing more, shouldn't the whole field be expanding? How did the researchers even measure the conceptual breadth of all of science to prove it was contracting?
They measured it using a concept called knowledge extent. To calculate knowledge extent, they utilized advanced large language models to project those millions of research articles into what is known as a high-dimensional embedding space.
Let us try to visualize that high-dimensional embedding space because the terminology is dense.
Imagine a colossal three-dimensional map of the universe.
But instead of stars and galaxies, every single point of light suspended in the space is a research paper.
Papers that are conceptually highly similar, say two separate papers exploring the genetics of a specific drought-resistant tomato plant, are grouped very close together in this space.
While papers that are entirely unrelated, like a paper on quantum cryptography and a paper on the sociopolitical impact of medieval poetry, are located light years apart.
By mapping 41 million papers within this universe, the researchers can actually measure the physical distance, the knowledge extent of different scientific fields.
That spatial visualization makes a lot of sense, and what the analysis demonstrated within this conceptual universe is striking. Research that is augmented by artificial intelligence occupies a noticeably narrower volume of space.
It focuses on a significantly tighter scope of scientific topics compared to traditional non-augmented research.
It is not pushing out into the unexplored dark regions of the map. It is clustering tightly around existing, highly illuminated centers of knowledge.
And the data shows there's significantly less follow-on engagement in artificial intelligence research. You would think a groundbreaking artificial intelligence paper would inspire hundreds of scientists to branch out and pioneer entirely new, radical fields of inquiry.
But the mapping shows the exact opposite behavior. Papers that cite artificial intelligence research tend to cluster intensely together.
They produce highly overlapping work that simply converges on established solutions to already known problems. They're optimizing existing spaces rather than discovering new ones.
If an artificial intelligence is just looking for the most mathematically efficient way to improve an existing lithium-ion battery, it might find the absolute local operational maximum for that specific chemistry.
But it is never going to take a leap of logic, look at a completely unrelated field, and invent a fundamentally new type of energy storage. It optimizes the known. It does not explore the unknown.
If we connect this contraction of science back to the broader themes we discussed earlier, a clear and concerning pattern emerges. We are witnessing the automated amplification of a Matthew effect.
The Matthew effect is a sociological phenomenon often summarized as the rich get richer and the poor get poorer.
In the context of the scientific map, a small number of superstar data-rich topics attract almost all of the attention, the grant funding, and the artificial intelligence optimization.
Meanwhile, the foundational scientific questions, the really tough, messy inquiries that lack massive, cleanly formatted data sets, are just left behind in the dark.
Because artificial intelligence requires massive amounts of data to function effectively, it naturally drags the entire scientific community toward problems that are easy for computers to solve, rather than the problems that might be the most important for humanity to actually understand.
Furthermore, the widespread introduction of large language models adds an entirely new layer of risk regarding research integrity. These models possess an incredible persuasive fluency of prose.
They can generate text that sounds incredibly authoritative, grammatically flawless, and structurally perfect.
And that persuasive fluency can act as a massive smokescreen. It makes deep methodological weaknesses much harder for peer reviewers to detect.
If a paper is poorly written, reviewers naturally look closer at the math. But if the introduction and literature review are eloquent and authoritative, it lulls the reviewer into a false sense of security.
It is the ultimate form of social desirability bias, but executed by a machine.
Which elevates the massive risk of artificial intelligence hallucination. This is where a language model generates plausible-sounding, perfectly formatted, but entirely fabricated citations and seamlessly introduces them into the scientific literature.
If a junior researcher is under immense pressure to publish before their contract expires, and a machine generates a perfectly formatted but entirely fake citation that perfectly supports their shaky hypothesis, the temptation to just leave it in the manuscript is enormous.
The barrier to committing misconduct has been lowered from actively falsifying data to simply failing to double-check a machine's output.
As these tools drastically lower the cost and effort required to produce credible-looking scientific content, the sheer volume of literature will inevitably explode. We are going to see a flood of mathematically perfect, beautifully written, but scientifically hollow papers.
In this environment, the critical thinking skills taught by tools like the Unlock the Lab application become exponentially more vital than they were even 5 years ago.
We need human minds to push the actual boundaries of knowledge. True science requires diverse, decoupled exploration.
It requires a human being looking at weird, anomalous data that completely fails to fit the pattern and deciding to investigate it rather than smooth it out.
Over-relying on pattern recognition algorithms threatens to trap us in a highly optimized but fundamentally limited understanding of the universe.
To synthesize the core lessons from the diverse source materials we have explored today, we must recognize that science literacy is no longer just about understanding facts. It is about understanding systems.
We began by looking at how the Unlock the Lab workshop demystifies the scientific process. By using peer-anchored prediction and forcing users to confront their own biases, it equips people with the specific tools needed to spot methodological red flags, to demand open access, and to look past sensationalized media narratives.
The overriding insight here is that our scientific record is fundamentally a curated highlight reel, not an objective logbook. A healthy dose of skepticism is an absolute requirement for navigating it.
You cannot just read a headline about chocolate making you a math genius and accept it as truth, especially in an era where questionable research practices are fueled by intense career pressures and a relentless academic culture.
Understanding the human and institutional dynamics behind a published paper is just as critical as understanding the data presented within it.
A flawlessly executed experiment means very little if the researchers deliberately hid 3 other failed experiments in their file drawer to make this one look groundbreaking. We must evaluate the ecosystem as critically as we evaluate the evidence.
So, to leave you with a final provocative thought, something to deeply consider as you consume information tomorrow.
This raises a profound question regarding the future trajectory of our entire knowledge system. If generative artificial intelligence continues to narrow the focus of scientific inquiry, creating a contracted landscape of highly overlapping, optimized research, what happens in the coming decades?
Specifically, what happens when future artificial intelligence models are trained almost entirely on the synthetic, homogeneous data produced by the previous generations of artificial intelligence?
That is a staggering concept. It could create a massive, inescapable epistemic echo chamber.
Systemic biases, file drawer omissions, and methodological blind spots would not just be human errors anymore. They would become permanently baked into the very mathematical fabric of automated scientific discovery.
The machine would just keep reinforcing its own narrow, optimized view of the universe, endlessly confirming what it already believes.
We challenge you to consider how educational frameworks and critical thinking tools will need to rapidly evolve. How will we train the next generation of human minds to pierce through endless layers of mathematically perfect, artificial intelligence-generated consensus to find the messy, unoptimized truth?
It is going to require a willingness to question the very structures that produce our knowledge.
Thank you so much for your time today. Keep questioning, keep exploring, and most importantly, keep reading science like a scientist.